Deep inside a logistics center in South Carolina, there is a section of shelving that rarely sees the light of day. It is quiet here. The air smells of old cardboard and decaying wood. If you were to pull down one of these crates and blow off the dust, you would find thousands of small purple boxes. And inside each one is a medal, the Purple Heart, the award given to an American soldier who has been wounded in combat or killed in action. But here is the terrifying part. These medals weren't made for the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan or even Vietnam. In fact, if you check the serial numbers, you will find they were all manufactured in the summer of 1945. The United States government manufactured 500,000 of these medals in anticipation of a single event, the invasion of mainland Japan. They didn't order these medals because they thought they were winning. They ordered them because they expected the American army to be fed into a meat grinder that would make D-Day look like a training exercise. This is the story of the lost invasion and the grim mathematical calculation that forced the world into the atomic age. To understand why American generals expected a massacre, you need to understand what they had just witnessed on the islands of Saipan and Okinawa. On Saipan, in June 1944, the Japanese garrison numbered roughly 30,000 soldiers. When the battle ended, fewer than 1,000 surrendered. The rest fought to the death. But that wasn't the worst part. Thousands of Japanese civilians, men, women, and children, threw themselves off cliffs rather than surrender to American forces. They called it Banzai Cliff or Suicide Cliff. Mothers held their babies and jumped. Entire families leaped into the sea. Why? Because Japanese propaganda had convinced them that Americans would torture and murder them. Fast forward to April 1945, Okinawa. The battle lasted 82 days and became the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific War. American casualties, over 50,000, including 12,000 dead. The Japanese, over 100,000 soldiers killed, and somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians dead. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief military advisor, did the math. At Okinawa, the casualty rate was 35%. Some calculations put it even higher, 39%. More than 1 in 3 Americans who landed on that island became a casualty. In Washington, generals looked at the numbers and drew a terrifying conclusion. If they fight like this on a small island 300 miles from the mainland, what will they do when we invade Japan itself? The Japanese weren't preparing to surrender. They were preparing for Ketsu-Go, Operation Decisive, and they knew exactly where the Americans would land. Ultra-code-breaking intelligence revealed that Japan had correctly predicted the invasion beaches on Kyushu. They were fortifying the exact locations where American forces planned to land. By July 1945, intelligence estimates showed 680,000 Japanese defenders on Kyushu alone. The number kept climbing. But Japan wasn't just mobilizing soldiers. They were mobilizing everyone. 2.3 million troops, 28 million civilian militia. Every man, woman, and child was being trained to fight. Schoolgirls were issued bamboo spears and taught to charge American tanks. The slogan plastered across Japan, "The glorious death of 100 million." The entire population would fight. The entire population would die if necessary. The Japanese dug thousands of underground bunkers and tunnel complexes. They hid 10,000 kamikaze planes in caves and forests. They stockpiled suicide boats in every cove. At Okinawa, kamikaze attacks had killed 12,300 Americans and wounded 36,400 more. For the defense of Kyushu, Japan planned to launch those 10,000 planes at the invasion fleet. Japanese planners calculated they could sink 400 ships, targeting not destroyers but troop transports. The goal was to drown American soldiers before they even reached the beach. Post-war analysis estimated that kamikaze attacks alone could destroy or damage up to 1,000 American ships. Japan couldn't win. Their generals knew that. But they could make victory so expensive, so bloody, that America would negotiate for peace. Let Japan keep Korea. Let Japan keep some dignity. Just stop the invasion. Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. It would be the largest amphibious operation in human history, dwarfing even D-Day. The plan was divided into two phases. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1st, 1945, X-Day. Then Operation Coronet, the invasion of Honshu and the drive toward Tokyo, set for March 1946. The first wave alone would involve 14 divisions, over 800,000 combat troops. By the time Coronet launched, the total force would exceed 5 million personnel and require more than 3,000 ships. This wasn't just bigger than D-Day. It was bigger than every amphibious operation in history combined. But size wasn't the problem. Geography was. Japan's terrain was a nightmare for attackers. Mountains covering 80% of the country. Rice paddies that turned into mud traps. Narrow coastal plains perfect for defensive killing zones. Tanks would be useless. Artillery would be limited. It would be infantry against fortified positions, house by house, cave by cave. On D-Day, the Allies landed 156,000 troops and suffered roughly 10,000 casualties in the first 24 hours. Olympic planned to put 766,000 men ashore in the first days. If the casualty rate matched D-Day, and every indication suggested it would be far worse, the numbers would be catastrophic. In June 1945, President Truman called a meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The question on the table? How many Americans will die if we invade Japan? General Douglas MacArthur, who would command the invasion, gave his estimate first. 94,000 battle casualties in the first 90 days on Kyushu alone, plus another 12,600 from disease and accidents. Total, 106,850 casualties. Admiral Leahy wasn't convinced. He pointed to Okinawa. He told Truman, "We suffered 35% casualties there. We should expect the same or worse." Running those numbers against the 767,000 troops assigned to Kyushu meant over 268,000 American casualties just in the first phase. Other estimates were even grimmer. The Joint War Plans Committee projected 193,500 battle casualties if both Olympic and Coronet succeeded quickly. If the fighting dragged on, the Sixth Army's medical staff, the people who would actually treat the wounded, estimated 394,000 casualties. Some said 500,000. Others, including former President Herbert Hoover, predicted 500,000 to 1 million American fatalities. Think about that. American deaths in the entire Pacific War, from Pearl Harbor to the summer of 1945 totaled around 100,000. The invasion of Japan was expected to quadruple that number in 6 months. Some estimates from the War Department went even higher, 1.7 to 4 million total U.S. casualties, with 400,000 to 800,000 dead. The order is placed. In June 1945, President Truman called a meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The question on the table was whether or not to invade Japan, whether it was worth the cost in human lives, is not at all certain. Faced with these numbers, the Quartermaster Corps began preparing for industrial-scale death. The orders went out. We need hospital beds. We need plasma. We need morphine by the hundreds of thousands of doses. We need body bags, and we need Purple Hearts. Lots of them. In the summer of 1945, 4 major manufacturers received contracts to produce Purple Heart medals around the clock. The dies were cast, the ribbons were cut, the boxes were printed. By the end of 1945, over 1,506,000 Purple Hearts had been manufactured. That wasn't optimism. That wasn't bureaucratic overestimation. That was cold, hard logistics based on the worst-case scenarios calculated by generals who had seen Normandy, who had survived the Pacific, who knew exactly how much blood would be spilled on Japanese soil. The medals were ready, the ships were loaded, the troops were boarding transports. But 2,000 miles away, in the New Mexico desert, a flash of light was about to change the math.
July 16, 1945, Alamogordo, New Mexico. The Trinity Test. The world's first atomic bomb detonated with a force equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. J. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the fireball rise, later recalled a line from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." President Truman was at the Potsdam Conference when he received the news. The bomb worked. And suddenly, there was an alternative to Operation Downfall. August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima. 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent. Tens of thousands dead instantly. August 9th, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. The combined death toll from both bombings, between 150,000 and 250,000 by the end of 1945. Horrific. Unimaginable. But in the cold calculus of military planning, far fewer than the millions of Japanese casualties and hundreds of thousands of American casualties expected from an invasion. August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio, the first time ordinary Japanese citizens had ever heard him speak. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he said, in the most understated announcement of surrender in history. In American factories, the Purple Heart production lines wound down. Contracts were fulfilled or quietly canceled. The medals already manufactured, over 1.5 million of them, were boxed and stored. The invasion fleets turned around. The 14 divisions staging for Olympic stood down. Operation Downfall was canceled. 500,000 American soldiers who would have stormed Japanese beaches in November went home instead. And in warehouses across America, 500,000 Purple Hearts sat in darkness. Medals for wounds that were never inflicted. Medals for soldiers who never had to die. The medals through time. But here's where the story gets truly haunting. Those medals, they're still being used. Korea, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Marines fighting in sub-zero temperatures against Chinese forces. Over 4,000 American casualties. The Purple Hearts pinned to their uniforms, manufactured in 1945 for the invasion of Japan. Vietnam. The Tet Offensive. Thousands of Americans wounded in brutal urban combat. The medals they received? Still from that 1945 stockpile. Iraq. American forces invade Baghdad. Soldiers wounded by IEDs and firefights are awarded Purple Hearts. Check the manufacturing date. 1945. Afghanistan. A Marine loses his leg to a roadside bomb in Helmand Province. The Purple Heart pinned to his chest at Walter Reed Medical Center? Made 65 years earlier for a battle that never happened. The stockpile was so vast that the United States didn't need to manufacture significant new Purple Hearts until the year 2000, 55 years after the end of World War II. Even today, an estimated 60,000 of those 1945 medals remain in military supply depots. Think about that. Every Purple Heart ceremony you've witnessed in your lifetime, every medal you've seen in a museum or on a veteran's uniform, there's a substantial chance it was originally made for a soldier who was supposed to storm the beaches of Japan in November 1945.